Right now, crossing live to Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. There he is, Daniel Shaw, now joining us here on RT International. Daniel, it's great to have you on this program. I know you're keeping a close watch on this. The Russian defense minister stressing that Russia-Cuba relations are on the rise today. I would assume that Havana welcomes that outlook, but how about partners in certain Western countries? What do you think their position would be?
Greetings, Rory. I want to first say I was in Havana recently, and what I heard from the Cuban people over and over and over is that they would be starving if it wasn't for Moscow, if it wasn't for the Russians and the deals around tourism, around wheat and food, and these different ways of breaking the U.S.'s a unilateral blockade. The Cubans said that they would be starving. So I wanted to start with that very human note because that shook me to the core to hear that over and over. Again, we see high-level meetings between the Russians and the Cubans. This is obviously not pleasant news for those in Washington that wants to suffocate, blockade, and make things extremely difficult, both for this island only 90 miles away from the Florida Keys and for this powerful country halfway across the world, Russia, and how important that the club of sanctioned and blockaded countries continue to find one another to Washington's chagrin.
You know, Daniel, an interesting side note here. As you say, Cuba is 90 miles or so from the Florida Keys. It really is in the back garden there of the Sunshine State. Biden's been talking about this in recent days. I know basically since 2019, China has had, well, what America calls a spy bureau in Cuba. But now we know that China is essentially working with Cuba to what we understand as being that they're going to build a Chinese, what some are calling a military base or a military facility in Cuba. It kind of harks back. It kind of reminds me of the old Cuban Missile Crisis going back to the Soviet Union. I mean, how big of a deal would it be to have Beijing stationed on the doorstep of the southern U.S. if this Chinese facility does get finalized in Cuba? You said it's only 90 miles from the Florida Keys.
Well, the Cubans certainly have the right to their own sovereignty, to make their own self-determining economic, military, and diplomatic decisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was a NATO-U.S. missile crisis as well, and a Turkish missile crisis, because they had nuclear warheads pointed at the Soviet Union for how many years and decades, and the Western press never uttered a word in critique of that. So there's so many double standards on display here. The United States continues to occupy the South China Sea, continues to surround China with all types of military threats. How many tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers stationed in South Korea, now the Philippines. They're continually sending more of their troops there, as well as in Japan. So certainly the Cubans have the right to broker the deals that they want with the Chinese. And for the U.S. to critique this puts on full display how they constantly have a double standard when it comes to these geopolitical and geoeconomic and geomilitary matters.
What about when you talk about, I guess, geopolitics and geoeconomic matters? There are ideas out there that Cuba could be looking to join the BRICS family alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Then you've got BRICS Plus. And as I understand, there are like 24 other countries who want to join BRICS. If indeed Havana were to be accepted into the BRICS family, how could that adjust Cuba's position on the global geopolitical chessboard, do you think?
I think it would be an incredibly important geopolitical move. The Cuban people are suffering right now. The special period did not end when the Soviet Union imploded or collapsed in 1991. This left, in the entire Warsaw Pact nations, this left Cuba virtually alone and isolated as the sole bastion of socialism, of anti-imperialism, almost in the entire world for a decade there. And for the Cubans now now, and it's not just the Cubans who want to join BRICS Plus, it's the Argentinians. I've read that dozens of Middle Eastern countries are trying to join. So the center of political and economic gravity in the world is moving away from the United States. The Chinese GDP, Chinese economic output could pass that of the U.S. in the next decade. So there is a multipolar world, not just on the horizon, but really on the doorstep. I think we're living through what historians will call world-shaking changes. We see the Saudis sitting down with the Russians, and the Saudis brokered this deal with the Chinese and the Iranians, and Syria has returned to the Arab League. These are all things that we could not have predicted even a year ago, Rory.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. Like you said, we all basically have front row seats to the biggest changes happening in 100 years. This multipolar world, that is quite something incredible. I mean, amazing times we're living through right now. Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Daniel Shaw. Always appreciate the opportunity to pick your brain. Thanks very much for joining us here.
Thanks. Thank you.